I'm Dr. Owen Anderson, and we're looking at Immanuel Kant, who really did more than anyone else to usher in the modern dark age of the mind. Now, he had been a rationalist, but when he read the skepticism of David Hume, he says he was awakened from his dogmatic slumbers, dogmatic meaning rationalist slumbers, and instead wanted to find out how to respond to Hume. Hume had basically said reason doesn't tell us about the world. So Kant came up with his transcendental argument. You can't use reason to prove God exists. It always ends up in contradictions. You just have to presuppose God, freedom, and immortality. So in this lecture, I'm going to look at his antinomies of pure reason, which is examples he gives in theistic arguments where reason fails to take us to God. It leads to only contradictions. Antinomies. First antinomy. The world has a beginning in time and is also limited in regard to space. So the world has a beginning in time and is limited in regard to space. That's a thesis. The antithesis, the world has no beginning and no limits in space, but is in relation to both time and space infinite. And then he gives arguments from reason to show both, to show that we can't know one way or the other. We can't know from reason. So the proof that the world had a beginning in time, granted that the world has no beginning in time, up to every given moment of time, an eternity must have elapsed, and therewith passed away an infinite series of successive conditions or states of things in the world. Now, the infinity of a series consists in the fact that it can never be completed by means of a successive synthesis. So up until this moment now, there had been an infinity if the world had no beginning. But you can't go from an infinity to the present. So it follows that an infinite series already elapsed is impossible, and that consequently a beginning of the world is a necessary condition of its existence. Okay. But then he says the antithesis proof. For let it be granted that the world has a beginning. A beginning is an existence which is preceded by a time in which the thing does not exist. But on the above supposition, it follows that there must have been a time in which the world did not exist. That is, a void time. But in a void time, the origination of a thing is impossible because no part of any such time contains a distinctive condition of being. In other words, you have non-being and all of a sudden being. That's an uncaused event. You can't get being from non-being. So there couldn't have been only nothing, and the world couldn't have an infinity of changing. Now I'm going to suggest the solution. The solution seems to be glaring at you, but he thinks that proves the thesis and antithesis both have sound arguments and reason is at a loss. Observation on the first antinomy. On the thesis. In bringing forward these conflicting arguments, I have not been on the search for sophisms for the purpose of availing myself of special pleading, which takes advantage of the carelessness of the opposite party, appeals to a misunderstood statute, and erects its unrighteous claims upon an unfair interpretation. Both proofs originate fairly from the nature of the case, and the advantage presented by the mistakes of the dogmatists of both parties has been completely set aside. So he's just saying he's not doing a straw man. He wants the strongest argument from both sides. The thesis might also have been unfairly demonstrated by the introduction of an erroneous conception of the infinity of a given quantity. A quantity is infinite. If a greater than it cannot possibly exist. So infinite means that in which a greater cannot exist. The quantity is measured by the number of given units, which are taken as a standard contained in it. Now, no number can be the greatest because one or more units can always be added. It follows that an infinite given quantity, consequently an infinite world, is impossible. You could always add one more grain of sand or one more moment. It is therefore limited in both respects. In this manner, I might have conducted my proof, but the conception given in it does not agree with the true conception of an infinite whole. So he's going over here a weaker version that he thinks wouldn't have been successful compared to his stronger version. And then observations on the first antinomy on the antithesis. The proof in favor of the infinity of the cosmological succession and the cosmological content is based upon the consideration that in the opposite case, a void time and a void space must constitute the limits of the world. Now, I'm not unaware that there are some ways of escaping this conclusion. It may, for example, be alleged that a limit to the world as regards both space and time is quite impossible, without at the same time holding the existence of an absolute time before the beginning of the world, or absolute space extending beyond the actual world, which is impossible. So here's one problem. Time is the measurement of change. If there's nothing changing, there's no time, there's nothing to measure. Space is the relationship between material objects. If there are no material objects, there's no relationship between them. So he gets into a question of how to speak of, it's not as if there's something called space from eternity and then matter pops into it. Sometimes modern cosmologists talk that way, but what they mean is there's like this quantum field in space and it has quantum foam, which makes matter pop into existence. So it's not that there's space and time and then matter's put in. That's not what he's talking about so much as non-being producing being, which he says is impossible. And he interestingly gets really caught up in the infinite and the finite question. Second conflict of the transcendental ideas. Every composite substance in the world consists of simple parts, and there exists nothing that is neither itself simple or composed of simple parts. So everything that's made in the world is composed of simple parts. And nothing is either it's not itself simple or made of simple parts. So grant the complete opposite. Before I get to the proof, let me read the other one. No composite thing in the world consists of simple parts, and there does not exist in the world any simple substance. So on that side, all things can be broken down further and further into smaller parts. On this side, there are simple parts, the smallest things you can think of. So what's the proof of that? Well, for grant that composite substances do not consist of simple parts. In this case, if all combination or composition were annihilated in thought, no composite part and no simple part could exist. Consequently, no substance. Consequently, nothing would exist. Either then, it is impossible to annihilate composition in thought, or after such annihilation, there must remain something that subsists without composition, that is, something which is simple. Substance, which is not made up of other things, it's the basic stuff. The other proof, let it be supposed that a composite thing consists of simple parts, inasmuch as all external relation, consequently all composition of substance is possible only in space. The space occupied by that which is composite must consist of the same number of parts as is contained in the composite. But space does not consist of simple parts, but of spaces. Therefore, every part of the composite must occupy a space, but the absolutely primary parts of what is composite are simple. So it follows that what is simple occupies space. Now, as everything real that occupies a space contains a manifold, the parts of which are external to each other, and is consequently composite, and a real composite not of accidents, but of substances, it follows that which is simple must be a substantial composite. So if it takes up space, it can always be broken into smaller parts. That's the argument. So you get an antinomy then. Is there substance, a basic stuff, or is there only smaller and smaller parts out of which everything's made? And so he has his reflections here, but I'm going to go on to the third antinomy. The third antinomy, causality according to the laws of nature is not the only causality operating to originate the phenomena of the world. A causality of freedom is also necessary to account fully for these phenomena. There is no such thing as freedom, but everything in the world happens solely according to the laws of nature. So let it be supposed that there is no other kind of causality than that according to the laws of nature. Consequently, everything that happens presupposes a previous condition, which it follows with absolute certainty in conformity with a rule. But this previous condition must itself be something that has happened, that has arisen in time as it did not exist before. For if it had always been in existence, its consequent or effect would not thus originate for the first time, but would likewise have always existed. So the causality, therefore, of a cause whereby something happens, is itself a thing that has happened. Now, this again presupposes, in conformity with the law of nature, a previous condition and its causality, and this another, so on. If then everything happens solely in accordance with the laws of nature, there cannot be any real first beginning of things, but only a subaltern of comparative beginnings. So again, you have a long chain of events all governed by necessity. There cannot, therefore, be a completeness of series on the side of the causes which originate the one from the other. But the law of nature is that nothing can happen without a sufficient a priori determined cause. The proposition, therefore, if all causality is possible only in accordance with the laws of nature, is, when stated in this unlimited and general manner, self-contradictory. It follows this cannot be the only kind of causality. And then granted there exists freedom in the transcendental sense as a pure kind of causality operating to produce events in the world, a faculty, that is to say, of originating a state and consequently of a series of consequences from that state. In this case, not only the series originated by this spontaneity, but the determination of the spontaneity itself to the production of the series. That is to say, the causality itself must have had an absolute commencement, and nothing can proceed to determine this action according to the unvarying laws. So everything happens according to those laws, even the production of supposed freedom. On the other hand, you can't just have a line of necessary causes. He thinks that's an antinomy. And there's no freedom. If there's no freedom, there could be no morality. So reason can't prove God. It can't prove the world had a beginning. That would be the world had a beginning, simple substance, God, and it can't prove freedom, which is necessary for morality. And the fourth conflict of the transcendental ideas. There exists either in or in conjunction with the world, either as its part or as the cause of it, an absolutely necessary being. An absolutely necessary being does not exist either in the world or out of it as its cause. Then he gives proofs of this. The world of sense, as a sum total of all phenomena, contains a degree of changes. For without such a series, the mental representation of the series of time itself as a condition of the possibility of the sensuous world could not be presented to us. But every change stands under its condition, which precedes it in time and renders necessary. So it follows that something that is absolutely necessary must exist if change exists as its consequence. And the antithesis, grant that either the world itself is necessary or that there is contained in it a necessary existence. Two cases are possible. First, there must either be in the series of cosmical changes a beginning, which is unconditionally necessary and therefore uncaused, which is at variance with the dynamical law of determination of all phenomena in time. Or secondly, the series itself is without beginning, and although contingent and conditioned in all its parts, is nevertheless absolutely necessary and unconditioned as a whole, which is self-contradictory. So there can't be a necessary beginning and there can't be a necessary part. So there's no necessary being, which is God. As observations on the fourth antinomy. So the interest, here right after those, he goes over the interest of reason in these self-contradictions. We have thus completely before us the dialectical procedure of the cosmological ideas. No possible experience can present us with an object adequate to them in extent. More reason itself cannot cogitate them as according with the general laws of experience. And yet they are not arbitrary fictions of thought. On the contrary, reason in its uninterrupted progress in the empirical synthesis is necessarily conducted to them when it endeavors to free from all conditions and to comprehend in its unconditioned totality that which can only be determined conditionally in accordance with the laws of experience. So the brilliant claims of reason striving to extend its dominion beyond limits of experience have been represented above only in dry formula, which contain merely the grounds of its pretensions. The grounds of the pretension of reason, to go beyond experience, which it cannot do, he says. Unfortunately for speculation, but perhaps fortunately for the practical interests of humanity, reason, in the midst of her highest aspirations, finds herself hemmed in by a Oh, this got cut off. By a press of opposite and contradictory conclusions from which neither her honor nor her safety will permit her to draw back. So the limits of reason are established. And we end up in these antinomies. Dogmatism on the one hand, if there does not exist a supreme being distinct from the world, if the world is without beginning, consequently without a creator, if our wills are not free and the soul is divisible and subject to corruption just like matter, the ideas and principles of morality all lose all validity and fall with the transcendental ideas which constitute their theoretical support. So there's his argument, transcendental argument on the side of the antithesis or empiricism. We have to assume those, or we end up in that the loss of all morality. And he says this is found in an original opposition between Epicureanism and Platonism. Both Epicurus and Plato asserted more in their systems than they know. The former encourages and advances science when he says all is atoms and a void. You can study them, and the latter presents us with excellent principles for the investigation of the practical, but in relation to everything regarding which we can attain to speculative cognition permits reason to append idealistic explanations of natural phenomena. So he wants to uphold God, the soul, and immortality, and freedom to do morality. And he's going to argue speculative reason can't get us to prove those. It ends up in contradictions, which is why no one knows. The reason why no one knows is because reason fails. But practical rationality has to assume them, presuppose them. So that's the darkness. The dark age of a mind is in denying the ability of reason to arrive at conclusions. Instead, it leads to this, and they're in contradiction. And instead, we have to just assume them. That's fideism. So others take it as skepticism, and they'll reject God altogether on these same grounds. So just like he speaks here, the Epicurean, the skeptic, and Plato, the fideist, we see that in the modern world. Those who might say, no, this proves we need scripture because reason fails us. Or those who say, this proves there is no God, we only have atoms in the void. What I'm going to suggest as we continue on is back up here. Let me scroll back up. In his antinomies, each of these is solvable. I might even begin with, I think he runs into problems when the second and third, he's in problems about what is infinite and what is simple, which when we look at the presuppositions of those ideas, I think we can find the solutions. Fourth, the idea of a necessary being, I think, is also problematic. But we can go to the first one. It's as if 2, 3, and 4 have assumptions. Scroll back over here, make you dizzy, huh? Sorry. 2, 3, and 4 have assumptions, and that's the method. That's what I propose. His idea that practical rationality has presuppositions, we'll call that thinking presuppositionally. That's right. We should do that. We should expose assumptions or presuppositions and then test them by meaning. And each of his antinomies have assumptions that end up in this antinomy. And if we unpack those, we end up solving the antinomy by reason. So that's the method I would use to solve these supposed antinomies, which I don't think are antinomies. The material world had a beginning in time, but there is being that's not eternal or changing. Down here, he connected as if all being is changing. So he limits us to thinking of material things. And this side is the correct argument. What's matter had a beginning. This side's only held up by saying, well, but if you say that, then everything came from nothing. Well, there's eternal, changeless being. And we do something similar with the second one on the soul. You don't think of the soul as a composite of things made. You consider it in terms of the immaterial, in terms of thought, which is not made up of parts. Consciousness, which is not made up of parts in the way that material things are that break apart. Or the necessary being. This is already a problem. What counts as necessary? And a lot of times people are very fascinated to give proofs for the necessary being. But here's the one I would give. I would say, what counts as necessary being? and is connected up to this antithesis on this side, there must be something eternal. That's necessary. Something that had no beginning. And that's necessary because the opposite is a contradiction. The opposite is being came from non-being. There was an uncaused event and everything came into existence, or even just some things came into existence from nothing. Not God making them ex nihilo. There's nothing. That can't be true. So its opposite, something is eternal, must be true. That's a necessary being. So each of these antitheses aren't. They don't actually demonstrate the limits of reason. They demonstrate Kant's limited use of reason, and they expose him to show that he's without excuse in his skepticism. And he bequeathed this to the next 2 centuries. And we need to respond to Kant and show how no reason does reveal God, so that unbelief is without excuse.